From their earliest jazz-tinged hits of the 70s, Steely Dan were marked out as an outfit that would provide a cynical, sophisticated soundtrack for the laid-back rock kids of the 70s and beyond. With subtle lyrics and slick musicianship that separated them from the herd, they stampeded their way into the charts on both sides of the Atlantic with classic songs that have stood the test of time. No surprise that the song's writers have also lasted the distance. Today, in the fourth decade of their musical partnership, they're back at the helm of one of the most respected bands in the business. The roots of Steely Dan found fertile ground when two music-obsessed students got together at one of the musical hotbeds of the 60s college scene.
Well, we first met in college, Bard College in upstate New York, and yeah, we just, there was kind of a big blues craze in the early 60s, and we'd both been in blues bands and some jazz bands, and we both, you know, had the same enthusiasms, including jazz and blues and science fiction and comic novels and that sort of thing. So yeah, we got along pretty well.
We actually began playing together at Bard College. When I got there as a freshman, Donald had already been there a couple years, and I discovered that he was in every single band on campus, in every style of music, conceivable style of music, and so...
I wasn't in the polka band, though.
Neither was I.
Yeah.
So, you know, I realized that he was the guy to talk to, and, you know, at that time I was playing the guitar. I was playing bass. I was hoping to be a bass player up there at school, but I was also playing the guitar, and for some reason there wasn't a good guitar player up at Bard, so Donald decided to include me in his ensembles.
Well, when we both got out of college, we spent some time in New York City. We were living in Brooklyn at the time, actually, and working in Midtown in the Broadway music scene around the Brill Building and 1650 Broadway, where there was a lot of publishing offices and trying to sell songs, pop songs, and also trying to see if anyone was interested in our other book of songs, which was turned out to be the Steely Dan material.
After a couple of false starts and a soundtrack for a low-budget movie, Becker and Fagen headed for the West Coast, where an old friend was ready to do a favor.
Well, we actually started the band that played on the first record that we ended up calling Steely Dan. When we got out to Los Angeles, a friend of ours named Gary Katz had become an A&R man at a label there, and he signed us as songwriters and as artists. And we didn't have a band. He knew some guys that we hooked up with, and plus Denny Dias, who we had played with on Long Island in his band, and that was the beginning of the band. And you know, we sort of copped the name from a popular novel of the day because we needed to call it something. We had been calling ourselves, you know, Becker and Fagen and stuff like that, which sounded more or less like a delicatessen or some sort of, you know, tailoring outfit. So we were glad to have something else to use. Our buddy Gary Katz had gotten a job as an A&R guy, and he had been hired by this record company that wanted to hire a sort of hip underground guy, right? And so Gary arrived there, and we were the sort of hip underground artists that he knew. And so they signed us, and they said, well, go on in there and do it, guys. And we did. They pretty much let us do whatever we wanted to do, and that was the first album.
I guess we always thought that there was an audience for you know, our music. I don't think we ever thought it would be as big as it got to be, but we knew that a lot of people were bored with hearing the same three-chord type of music.
After releasing two more albums with mixed fortunes, including the departure of singer David Palmer, Steely Dan took a change of direction, with Donald Fagen becoming the voice of the band.
Well, I wasn't a singer to start with. We had always been looking for a singer, and when we first started the band, we imported a guy that one of the other musicians knew, Dave Palmer, and he was a good singer and sang a couple songs on the first album, but we felt that he just didn't have the right attitude sort of to express the sort of narrative point of view that we were looking for. So I started doing it by default, and I still am doing it by default.
I remember when we were first playing songs for people before we had a deal, we used to go in and I used to sing some of the songs and Donald would sing some of the songs, and I ended up singing more of them when we were standing around at somebody's office because I sang louder. And Donald was sort of down at the piano playing, you know, and when we started recording demos, we discovered an important fact, which was that Donald sounded great on microphone and also sang in tune. Well, we stopped touring in the 70s because it wasn't very much fun for us. Donald and I wanted to write songs and make records. That was our, you know, essentially what our ambition had been to do in the first place. And we ended up touring because we were convinced that we needed to do that to continue making records. The other guys in the band wanted to tour all the time, and so there was a natural conflict of interest there, and that's what ended up being the end of that band, per se.
With the founder members at the hub, Steely Dan became a freewheeling ensemble of the best session men in town.
Well, we were lucky enough to be able to hire some you know, idols of ours. Wayne Shorter comes to mind, tenor saxophone. Phil Woods, alto saxophone.
Chuck Rainey, great bass player. Bernard Purdy, Victor Feldman.
Yeah,
wonderful.
Both jazz musicians and rhythm and blues musicians.
Well, when we got to California, we saw that that's how records were being made. Whether there was groups or meant to be groups or individual artists or whatever, for a substantial portion of the really good sounding records were being made with this people taken from this pool of crack musicians that were the studio players in Hollywood. And we knew some of these guys from jazz records, you know, for example, Victor Feldman, who we knew from the Miles Davis records and Cannonball Adderley records, was playing, was the top percussionist in Hollywood film sessions and stuff like that. So we started using him for percussion and also for piano and vibes. And it was just a great resource and for us, you know, we'd write a song that we imagined some sort of, you know, exotic musicianship would make sound just great, and then we could sort of go out and find that guy.
I don't think we had any really specific sound in mind. We knew what we liked, you know, jazz harmony. We were both jazz fans as kids, and really our training, most of it self-training actually, was in jazz harmony. And although Walter actually had more of a background in folk and blues than I did, but so that was one element, and the other was really comic lyrics, which I think stemmed from our interest in comic literature of the 60s and before that. And there's quite a few other elements. It would be too hard to mention them now, but we sort of just combined them, and the sound is sort of what it ended up to be, really, when you combine all those things that we like.
It wasn't only the music that captivated the fans. The rich and densely populated narratives of their songs were also part of the appeal.
The characters in our songs are fictional characters, just like fictional characters in a novel or a short story, although not, you know, as fleshed out because of the constraints of songwriting. And, you know, the stories and the characters are sort of based on our own sense of life and experiences and, you know, so on, without actually being literally things that have happened to us.
There, you know, some are from our own experience, and others from people we knew in the music business when we were working on Broadway, or friends of ours, or just things we observed. So, you know, you'd get them from everywhere, really. For instance, Kid Charlemagne is based on sort of a combination of various guys who used to deal in hallucinogenic drugs in the 60s. A famous one was named Owsley, Augustus Owsley, and who made a very pure kind of LSD. And as the 60s sort of rolled to a thudding close, we were just sort of imagining what would he do now that the 60s were over, and there was this sort of reaction setting in against that kind of drug experience and so on. And, you know, since this was a very exciting time, you know, what was he going to do now? And that was part of what we based the character on.
1977's Aja found the band at its creative peak, bringing platinum sales, a Grammy Award, and 3 hit singles.
I think, you know, for a lot of reasons involving the kind of music that we wrote for that album and the particular sensibility that existed in the musical community of people that were playing on the album, it sort of all worked out really well. And
I think session musicians had been evolving a kind of style through the late 60s and 70s. These were musicians who were more experienced in jazz and various other kinds of music, but who were now playing rhythm and blues and rock and roll as a matter of course in their work, really every day playing sessions. So it was kind of there was a kind of moment when their style sort of coincided with our compositions. I think that's probably
an all too brief moment,
yeah,
as it turned
in a
out.
way, yeah.
Despite the success of Gaucho in 1980, Steely Dan was running out of steam.
We sort of burned out that particular mode of composition, and you know, I think we were tired too. So we, you know, we split up for a while and worked on our own projects. Well, in the early 90s, I was involved with a project called the New York Rock and Soul Review, and at the same time I was making a solo album, Kamakiriad, which Walter was producing. So we were thrown together a lot, and Walter ended up coming out on the Rock and Soul Review tour, during which we played a couple Steely Dan tunes, and they got a good response. So the next year, 93, I guess, we started going out again with a new band.
Having started off their dual careers as songwriters, the two have maintained their writing habit through the decades.
We've been collaborating for a long time, and generally what we do is we have a work routine, and we show up together at some place to work, and each of us has little ideas or starts, or we have things that we've worked on in the past that are sort of the spare parts heap, or the
running jokes,
the file of titles that we've been working on. You know, we'll work for a couple hours, then go out for a walk. Sometimes we see something, or we have some conversational riff going that develops into something. You know, I think it's the sort of usual type of thing. The only thing about it that I think is distinctive is that we're more like sort of a professional songwriting team, and that we get together at a certain time and do things rather than sitting around on the couch waiting for inspiration to strike. If anybody really writes that way, I'm not sure.
We sometimes phone each other up, and if we have an idea or if we just want to, you know, talk about something, but the actual writing usually gets done because we have an appointment.
Well, we've finished lyrics and stuff on the phone.
Yeah.
You know, we've had songs where we've, usually one of the last things, you know, we'll have most of the music at some point, but not most of the lyrics. So, typically,
especially when Walter was living in Hawaii.
Yeah, we'd write lyrics over the phone.
Right on the phone.
We had little headsets and everything, you know. It was very professional.
Over the next few years, each would produce solo projects for the other, until finally a new Steely Dan album was recorded.
Well, after a few years touring, we were a little tired of playing our old material, although a lot of it was played for the first time in the 90s on stage, since we didn't tour much in the 70s. But nevertheless, we wanted some new material. We didn't want to be like a revival act, really. We feel it's very important to keep the band vital, and so we knew we needed new material. We had ideas, and we also knew that audiences, it's hard for an audience to accept hearing new material cold. It's better if they've heard it on a record first. So we decided to make a record, and then the audience would at least have some preparation for what they were going to hear.
It's much more fun touring now than it was in the 70s in almost every way, because we have our own lights and sound show, and we have the band that we want. We have access to musicians, and we can afford to pay them and travel around and rehearse and all of that, and make it a very professional, satisfying representation of what we do. You know, the band we had in the 70s was, you know, some nights it was great, and some nights it was a disaster, you know, for all sorts of reasons.
And we were opening for other acts in the 70s a lot of the time and didn't have our own sound system and all that kind of stuff.
We just are able to do what we always wanted to do as far as, you know, making our songs sound good and on a stage.
Back on the road and back on track, Steely Dan have entered the new millennium to critical success and with renewed confidence.
You know, we have some stuff left over from this record in the studio, and then we have some ideas, so...
But leftovers, you know, it's not like leftovers like, you know, meatloaf that's been in the refrigerator
No, it just
for 2
didn't
weeks.
fit.
Yeah, we have some really good songs that we wrote.
So,
that,
when we get back, we'll figure out what we're going to do.
assuming we make it back.
Yeah,
you know.
assuming we ever get out of Europe.